Greetings. Thanks for joining me. It's Fred in Alaska. What I wanted to share with you today happened approximately 6 years ago on the Nushagak River. Uh, Tony, not his real name, um, he took his fishing boat, 32-foot fishing boat, upriver up the Nushagak as a home base to anchor out and use his skiff as a little satellite, run about, do his moose hunting. He went out one evening. He went out on evening tide, went upriver, anchored out just above Portage. And the next morning, morning tide, his wife and son, which his son was waiting for time off, and the following day his son would be off for a week. And so he brought his mom with him to go and meet Tony up at the boat. They got there shortly after morning tide and whatnot, and they started making their plan of action. They're going to go scout around, him and his son, and look for moose sign while, his wife just hung out on the fishing boat and, tended to, meals and coffee and stuff like that. It's just what they do. And so they take off to go scouting, him and his son. They go all the way up Nushagak, and they're drifting down. They're looking for signs of moose. Nothing. It's just dead. And so they decide, after a couple hours of that, it's wet out, it's cold. Let's regroup and start early in the morning. First light, as soon as we can see enough on the river, we'll go back up and we'll drift down. So they get back to the boat, and he said they hung out, they played cards and cribbage and stuff, and, ate dinner, had a good dinner, just having good family time. And he said just at twilight, just before it got 100% dark, they heard a scream. And he said the scream was loud, but it was far away, but it was loud. It was a classic air raid siren ending in a high-pitched scream, right? So they all look at each other, and his wife immediately said, that's a hairy man. That's a hairy man. No wonder you guys didn't see no moose. We're probably wasting our time. Let's go up Wood River or, up Nushagak or something like that. And he was like, no. Because he had heard stories, from his uncle and his uppa and stuff, but he really believed them, but he just didn't think it was gonna happen to him, kind of thing, So he just denied. He was like, nah, it's got to be something we're just unaware of, And his wife told him, hey, I know what it is, so we should probably not waste our time. Thought nothing of it, which he regrets later, but so he gets up real early the next morning, 4:30, coffee going, and gets his son up and moving around. They eat real quick. They had some fried spam, which, oh geez, I don't mind it fried on the boat every once in a while, but gosh, it's so salty. But anyway, so he had spam and eggs with his boy, and they filled up a thermos of coffee. His wife got up by this point and made him like a little snack bag, some summer sausage, crackers, and some other stuff, right? And sent them on their way. They took off. They went all the way up where they had gone the day before, up just about where Nushagak is, and started drifting. Thick fog had rolled in that morning, right? Very, very thick. And they drifted down. They're seeing nothing. The thick fog was making it really hard to see anything. His son was, he wasn't feeling it. He was like, Dad, I don't think we're going to see anything, This thick fog is going to make it hard to get a good shot. He was like, let's drift down. We'll come back up. The fog should lift. It should burn off, and maybe we'll see one, right there on the bank and make it easy. His son agreed. All right, we're here anyway. Let's do it. So they went up and down river a couple times, right? And at this point, there's other people going by in their skiffs, waving, whatever. And he said as they went up for the last time, and it's still thick fog, it's into daylight, but it's just such dense fog, They were losing hope on their trip. And at this point, Tony said he didn't sleep too good the night before on the boat, because there wasn't much room with his wife in the bunk with him and stuff. He didn't sleep too good, with elbows in his ribs and stuff like that. And so he was kind of tired. So when they got back up and were drifting that final time, he was kind of laid back and started kind of drifting off a little bit. And they were, I guess it would be to the east side of the river, right? So they were on the east side of the river in the channel, and they were just coming down towards or just below Henry Slough or something like that, because when he woke up, it was basically still thick fog and they were drifting. But he woke up to his son smacking him, startled the shit out of him, right? So he jumps up. His son is like, hey, Dad, and he's pointing at the riverbank, and Tony's waking up looking at the where his son's pointing, and all he sees is just dark shadows from the trees. And his son's whispering, hey, that thing is on the riverbank. I thought I was seeing things, but this thing is following us. And he's like, what are you talking about, right? So he sits up on the bench on the Lund skiff, and he's looking. And as he's looking where his son's pointing, all of a sudden he sees a movement himself. Dark shadow just moving right outside the tree line. But with the fog, he said it was really hard to determine size at first, because this thing, it looked like it was ducking down, then standing back up taller, ducking down. And all this, he just woke up, so he's like wrapping his mind around everything that's unfolding, right? He said as he stood up and grabbed his rifle and was looking, he was like, nah, I think we're seeing things, right? Because it just, the way the shadow was moving in the fog, he said it was so easy to like dismiss it. It wasn't nothing like, initially it wasn't tangible. It wasn't a shape to it. It was just a shadow they seen moving every so often, and he was like, oh, you're being paranoid, that scream scared you last night, right? And his son was like, no, I've been watching it. I thought I was seeing things too. Well, as they're discussing this, that tree line that they're drifting down next to, he said that at this point they're about 40 feet from where this shadow figure is, about 20 feet from the riverbank in the channel, and then about 15, 20 to where this shadow is moving along the tree line. He said they were on kind of a short straight shot, and it was going to come to a bend on the river, and there was no trees on this bend. It was just shrubs and stuff, and the tree line continued down, but the river turned, right? He said at that point he was chalking it up to we're seeing things still at this point, because there was nothing like hard concrete like, oh, there's a actual figure. It was just a shadow. And so he's like, I think we're seeing stuff. And then all of a sudden this thing really stands up, and he said when it stood up, it was evident it was humanoid like, on two legs, and walks, and they could see it in the fog walking out. Just as they're coming up to the bend in the river, this thing is kind of walking and came away from the tree line to follow the bend of the river, and it was ahead of them, and it got ahead of them further. It was moving a little faster than they were, and then it got to a point and then squatted down, and they saw it in the fog. It was just a shadow, but they saw it go over and squat down, almost like it was waiting for them. Creeped them both out. So they grabbed their guns and they're aiming, and his son's like, should we shoot? And he goes, no, we don't know what it is. I mean, it's speculation at this point, but he just woke up. He's tired, and he's trying to make sure his eyes are working right. He doesn't want to start firing. It could be a villager, screwing around in a ghillie suit. He didn't know. It'd be a dumb thing to do, but you just never know. He wanted to identify the target before firing, and his son was freaked out. So as they're getting closer, they start yelling, hey, we see you. Now you got to understand, it's dead quiet. They're drifting. The motor's not running. As they're coming to that bend, his son says, I'm going to fire it up. And, Tony's like, yeah, go ahead, fire it up. They didn't want the current to kind of bring them closer to shore, to the riverbank than they want to be, because this thing is just squatted down in the fog, maybe, 50 yards at most away at this point. Tony said as soon as they started yelling and his son fired up the skiff, Tony stood up and had one boot on one little bench seat, and then the other one up by the bow little bench seat. It's like a little triangle back up in there in the V-hole. He said when he put his foot up and he started yelling, he's holding his rifle, but he's yelling, hey, we see you. You're going to get shot playing dumb games, right? And he's yelling at this thing. And as he's saying this stuff, all of a sudden it stands up again, and he really gets to understand this thing was huge. He said it was every bit of 10 foot tall. He's guessing about 4.5 foot wide. And when it stood up, it kind of turned profile and started walking back towards the trees. And they're just kind of in shock, like, what the hell? This thing turns, and he couldn't make out any features. The fog was so dense, it was just shadow and silhouette, right? Even though it was daylight behind them and stuff and all around, it was just he said the fog was so thick, I mean, you could see pretty clearly to the riverbank, but once it got up into the brush and stuff, it was so dense, it was hard to make out any features on this thing. And it turned back towards them after it took a few steps, turned towards them and screamed. He said the scream was startling. He almost fell out of the skiff just from being startled by how loud and powerful it was. It made his son instantly throw up. Made him feel like his insides were like jello, like reverberating with the scream. And he turns back and yells at his son after he drops down off the bench seat and says, "Go, go, go!" And his son's puking, so he can't operate the kicker because he's he's projectile vomiting, right? So he jumps back there, moves his son out of the way. His son's still puking inside the skiff now, but he's getting him out of the way so he can operate the outboard. He said when he got his son out of the way and started opening it up, it screamed again. And at this point, it had moved down the riverbank, and because he took eyes off it to help move his son and stuff. He said when he got control of the kicker and was opening it up to get on step and get out of there, this thing had moved down the riverbank a little ways to past where it was before, and was standing there, and it screamed again as he was trying to power past it. He said when it screamed that time, he got a little better look at it. He could make out dark, sunken eye area, heavy brow ridge. The nose looked kind of flat, real wide looking jaw, but that's the most description he could get. It wasn't defined at all. He couldn't see the finer features, couldn't tell if the face was wrinkly, couldn't tell the color of the skin. It was just dark. Said he powered out of that, went downriver, came around the bend because it kind of snaked back and forth, and he was just getting the hell out of there, right? His son's still not in a good condition. He's still dry heaving at this point because he had already expelled everything out of his stomach. And he kept asking him, "You okay?" His son's nodding yes, and breathing heavy and just dry heaving, one after another. Couldn't talk, was just in distress, right? So they get down around the bend, and they get a couple more bends down, and at this point he's on full step. He's getting the hell out of Dodge. He's looking out for any floating logs or anything like that. They come around another bend, and he said as they come around that bend, he hears like this scream again, and it sounds like it's right on top of him still. So he's glancing over at the riverbank, and he notices this thing off to their left-hand side at this point. It's moving along, and he can't, because of the fog and everything, he can't make out how it's moving so fast. He said it looked like it was just gliding along, right? Because he wasn't seeing any movement of legs or anything. It was just because of the fog and everything, it looked like it was gliding. And he's like, holy shit, So he's already got it wide open, and they're kicking along, and he's following the channel and everything, and he decides, I'm gonna get out of the channel a little more, away from shore. I don't know what the hell this thing's doing. And his son's still freaking out. He had stopped dry heaving at this point and was reaching for his rifle. He said, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." His son was shaking his head. He wasn't really responding to Tony telling him don't shoot. Son slides his rifle over, and he checks it, takes it off safety, and he points in that direction. He fires a shot, right? Tony said when he fired that shot, it was like all hell broke loose out of this thing, right? Because his son didn't aim at it. He just shot in that direction. This thing, he said, stopped and just let out this hellacious growl, like evil kind of. He said the growl was just as impactful as the scream, but it was more... It made him feel more like jello on the inside than the first scream that made his son throw up. And he said at that point, they're skiffing along at this point, but once his son fired and that growl happened and all that, this thing stopped following them down the river. So they go down a ways. Once he gets feeling like they're not being followed anymore, he slows down, check on his son, because his son was still, he was responsive, but he wasn't giving up many answers. He was still in the midst of like quasi dry heaving, but not full on vomiting. He's still like that. And he's like, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" He was like, "Yeah, I'm okay. It feels like someone kicked me in the gut." And so he's checking on his boy and stuff, and he had idled down and was just basically drifting again, right? They came down off step because he wanted to check on his son. He didn't want to just leave him there and potentially have him choking on his own vomit or anything like that. So he gets his son up on the bench as they're drifting away, and his son gets his attention and is pointing, and he starts on the verge of dry heaving again. He's trying to get his dad's attention, and he points back to shore. And on the riverbank, he turns around and looks back, and this thing is moving, and then stops, and then squats down and is looking at him again. And he can't see it actually looking at him because of the fog and everything, but it's facing them. He can sense it's looking at him. So he tells this boy, "Hang on," and he jumps back, grabs the outboard, and just opens it back up, gets back up on step, and they go back to the boat. He said that when they got back to the boat, he helped his son out of the skiff into the boat, and he sat on the stern, back in the stern on a buoy for a little while because he was still feeling sick. He didn't want to go inside and have to puke and clean it up. He'd just throw up over the stern. He said when they're sitting there, he was telling his wife what had happened, and because she was like, "What's wrong with my boy?" And he explains everything, and she was like, "Oh, geez, you guys, we need to let's just go home, and she had brought up, it being a waste of time since the scream the night before, or whatever. And, Tony, of course, was feeling bad enough, and of course, his wife is not reading him the riot act, but in essence, she was, it just in her own quiet way. And so he's like, "Yeah, we'll just, I'll pull up anchor, and we'll use the big boat and just drag the skiff home. We'll take our time." He agrees. He checks on his son. His son was doing a lot better. He said that once they got down below Portage on their way out, the fog had pretty much lifted. It was still overcast and everything, but it wasn't dense fog. The ceiling had lifted. And he said the ceiling it seemed just above tree line as they're going along, and he was continually checking on his son. His son said he was doing okay, and they were just kind of like nervously chuckling, like, "Wow, that was crazy, wow, Harry Man is just crazy." And as that was going on, off in the distance at that point, they heard another scream, and he said it had to have been miles away, but it was so loud, it made his son, like, not from the impact of the scream, but just from the thought, started making him sick again, like feeling ill to his stomach. And they just continued on, and his wife had nursed the boy and calmed him down, gave him a Sprite to drink and some saltine crackers to eat, and they just went on home. He said when he got home, he reached out to one of his relatives, and who happened to live up in Nushagak, and was telling him, "Hey, here's what happened," told him everything. And he said this particular relative kind of chuckled and said, "Oh, okay, yeah, we'll keep an eye out." And he said he didn't feel like his cousin was dismissing him, but he felt like his cousin wasn't taking it as serious as he should. So the following day he had called back, and just to reiterate, "Hey, this really happened. I'm not pulling your leg. This is what happened." And his cousin told him, "Yeah, had you called, I would have told you that there was a sighting over in that area, a couple days before this, and people had heard some screams. But again, a lot of people don't talk about it in the village because of the bad omen, the superstitious aspect of it." I want to thank Tony for sharing. I talked to his son briefly. He really didn't want to discuss too much about it. He just, kind of basically had the same thing to say his dad did. Outside of, when his son first saw this thing, shadow moving, he said he thought he saw a big man walking, but then because of the trees and everything, he thought maybe he was like seeing things, and come to find out he wasn't. And he said, next time I see something like that, I'm going to take it serious from the beginning, which fair enough. I want to thank his son as well for being willing to speak to me. I know it's not easy talking to strangers about stuff, and I want to thank Tony for making an effort to reach out and share this with everyone. Be aware in the woods. I don't want anyone to be scared of the woods. I go out in the woods all the time. Just be aware. You never know. You never know. And again, thank you, Tony. Like I told you on the phone, you're welcome to respond to comments if anyone has questions, or but you run the risk of people knowing who you are and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, thank you. I want to thank you guys for joining me, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.